Well, it's a psychological complex that is a product of politics and culture at the same time, and I think he would admit that Russia is not being treated fairly. He would admit this not directly, but indirectly he will. He will acknowledge that Russia's capabilities, Russia's talents, Russia's contribution to the world and to the world's stability are not accepted, are not recognized properly. That, to me, would amount to him recognizing Russia's inferiority. As a footnote, let me say, if you like, on record or off record, that my original title of this essay was The Dark Double. It was not Russia's inferiority complex. Because of these reasons, I thought that this deserves a separate treatment. But I think it's an accurate title. I think it is. It does speak about Russia's perceptions and Russia's cultural and political views of the world.
So are we on the path towards a new Cold War?
Well, it's hard to say what it is going to be. Cold War, to me, is something that we have lived through already. This is something that we have lived through during the Soviet-United States confrontation, Soviet-Western confrontation. And what Russia is going through today in relations with Western countries, with European countries and the United States is something quite different. It is a product of, you might say, old, historical, political, great power competition, great power rivalry. And you could see the Cold War itself, the Soviet-American Cold War, being a product or being a part, a type of that kind of competition, rivalry. So what we are now in is a new type of that rivalry rather than simply repetition of the Cold War. Because there are also major differences. Right now, Russia is not in the position to challenge United States supremacy. Russia is not in a position to compete in terms of the economic development with the United States or Western economies. So it is different in terms of Russia's material capabilities, but Russia still has major interests, major stakes, and different values, and this is where you have potential for future confrontation, future rivalry, and possibly even political confrontation with some elements of escalation, because we now have, what we have is essentially a proxy war in Ukraine, and we already have had and continue to have a proxy war in Syria, and there is a danger that that proxy war may escalate into a real war.
But do you not think that America did actually, in good faith, try to at least mend the bridges of the past? There was that famous reset moment with Hillary Clinton, and certainly under the previous U.S. Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton did try to restore ties, or at least good ties, between Russia and America. America did make the first move, which they feel has been rejected.
I think you're right. They did extend the effort. They did extend their desire to improve relationships with Russia, but it was done on their own terms, on the American terms. And this is not the first time when they did so. They still wanted Medvedev to be essentially a junior partner, someone who would follow the United States lead, someone who would be helpful, as American officials like to say, someone who would subscribe to United States views and essentially support U.S.-initiated United Nations resolutions, and Medvedev did oblige them once by abstaining on the Libya intervention in the United Nations Security Council. But in return, Russia certainly expected something from the United States. It did make some concessions, but it also expected a different treatment. It expected the United States to respect its interests, particularly in Eurasia, particularly in relations with Ukraine. It expected at least tacit recognition that Russia's values are not going to be exactly the same as United States values, because Russia historically has been a much more concentrated state, and for a number of reasons. It also expected Russia's recognition of status in world politics. All of this was important to Putin, and it was important to Medvedev as well. There is a consensus in Russia's political class that Russia is a power in world affairs, and it needs to participate and to contribute to world affairs as an equal power with the United States. And that continues to be the problem with U.S. authorities. And this is not the first time. This cycle of U.S. accepting Russia as a junior partner has not started with the reset. It is something that we have lived through in the 90s until Evgeny Primakov assumed the position of foreign minister. It is something that we lived through immediately following September the 11th, when Putin reached out to the United States and expected something in return, but instead he got the same kind of treatment. So this is really the third attempt, and the third failed attempt on part of Medvedev to rearrange relationships. And then, as you saw, as you remember, Medvedev himself got very frustrated in already 2010, and certainly in 2011. And what the United States did instead of learning its lessons, it sent Joe Biden to Moscow. And Joe Biden said in public and in private that he expected Vladimir Putin not to run for presidency.
Okay, so what you're really saying is you seem to be placing this deterioration in ties between Washington and Moscow to quite a long time ago, not necessarily recent events. It sounds like ahead of that reset, you're saying that wasn't actually done in good faith.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, and that has to do with a number of major security disagreements between the United States and Russia.
But there are security disagreements, to be fair, between the United States and a lot of countries, certainly with China. But the United States relies on China, and China probably doesn't feel that it's getting the respect it deserves from Washington. That's just how the United States does business, unfortunately.
I think I agree with you, but China is also a power that has some weaknesses in terms of being this dark double, in terms of being a helpful image of a potential rival and a potential enemy power. China is not comfortable to speak as assertively as Russia does in world affairs. Very frequently, China prefers to do business quietly through the back door. So Chinese are very different in world affairs. Russians have been quite actively taking issues with Western positions throughout their history. Russians, that probably speaks to their historical experience because they were not colonized, they were not defeated until the end of the Cold War, and even the end of the Cold War, many Russians do not see as a defeat. Whereas Chinese feel humiliation, and so do Indians, and so do many other former colonized powers. So they are not as comfortable to speak up, so to speak. That's what makes Russia more advantageous in the eyes of American elites as a potential rival power, as a double, so to speak, as a dark double with different values. Chinese also have different values, but the United States does not push this line in the media as much as it does with Russia.
And certainly in your piece, can I just ask, in your piece, though, you do make the point that the Kremlin has a more aggressive stance internationally. What do you mean by that in particular? Because when you talk about a more assertive Russia, what you're also kind of saying is that Russia also kind of feels vulnerable. So while from a position of strength, it also feels vulnerable, hence this term inferiority complex.
That's right. I think Russia does feel vulnerable, but so does China, and so does Brazil, and so does South Africa, and so does India. And yet none of them speak as actively and as assertively as Russia does. They only do so in concert. They do so through the BRICS meetings. They do so by issuing multipolar world declarations, by trying to pull some resources, by building slowly but surely elements of future configuration of new architecture in the world, building new economic and political architecture. But Russia is not limiting itself to this. Russia speaks assertively. It has both the fortitude and the attitude. And that's what makes Russia also a good potential enemy in the eyes of Western establishment, in the eyes of United States media, because United States media is certainly extremely active. The United States has a major advantage in the information war, and it needs a good target, so to speak, every day. And there are everyday statements coming from Russia, coming from Vladimir Putin, coming from Sergei Lavrov, from many other statesmen who are not shy to speak up. That's what's interesting.
But they always lose the information war, Russia does. I mean, you say that, let's take the Ukraine crisis at the moment.
Unfortunately, Russians are not doing as well as Americans in the information war.
But that's because Russia's message is for a domestic audience. It's not really for a global audience, which seems to suggest, I suppose, that Russia really isn't that concerned about what the West thinks anyway.
Well, I don't quite agree with this. I think Russia is trying to win a good portion of Western audience as well. This is not really targeting the American elites. This is targeting those who are able to go beyond the headlines, those who would be interested to reach out and read not just CNN and BBC, but also read and watch some non-Western sources. And Russia has Russia Today, for example, or some other sources, such as Voice of Russia, for example, that Westerners are able to have access to. So there is something to be said for Russia trying to reach out to the Western audience, but you're right, it's not about Western audience primarily. It's about Russians contributing to a new international order, to new multicultural order, to new types of selling information and presenting information. And it actually is not losing on that front, because it was able to have successful G20 summits, it was able to have successful BRICS summits. And on the Ukraine crisis, those countries outside the West have very different view, is very different position on what needs to be done today, for example, to stop that war, to make progress. This is not the U.S. position, not to mention that the United States and European countries, such as Germany, have different viewpoints as well.
But you talk about the US phobia of Russia. I mean, phobia is a strong word, and I suppose, okay, you can talk about the bias of American media, and probably a lot of people in Europe would agree with that. But in Europe, in Western Europe, we have a lot of different media sources, and I suppose what's really the crux of this US resentment towards Russia is what's happened in Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, and also the arming of rebels in eastern Ukraine, which is alleged to have taken place, plus allegations that the downing of an airliner had something to do with Russia. These are three key areas which probably explain this phobia more than the kind of geopolitical background.
My view is that it is certainly it has all the elements of violating the international law, but it also has a referendum, an important referendum that was successfully conducted. The violation here that took place was actually conducted within a relatively short period of time. There should have been longer time for this to occur, and it would have had more legitimacy in the eyes of the international community as a result of this. But nevertheless, it was certainly a violation of the international law, just as during the war with Georgia, Russia also violated international law. But you cannot see this event separately from the entire context. Russia is not the first to violate law in this case. Russia is not the first to deal with this issue. It actually responds to this issue. And the United States did not honor many of its commitments. It did not respect Russia's interests. So ultimately, it comes down to politics rather than to international law. It comes down to this rivalry that you and I have just discussed. And the rebel situation is the same. I don't work for the Kremlin, so I don't need to argue, for example, that Russia has no support for the rebels. Of course it does. Of course it provides all kinds of assistance, political assistance and military assistance. But from the point of international relations, from the point of international power rivalry, this is logical. This is what the United States should expect, because it provides all kinds of assistance for Kiev. It pushes Kiev to finish its anti-terrorist operation, which in fact will mean undermining Russia's interest in Ukraine. It will mean undermining ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, Russia-speaking Ukrainians' ability to speak the language that they prefer to speak in Ukraine. It will mean that Ukraine will have the blank check then to decide whether to join NATO or not. This is something that certainly Russia will continue to resist. from the balance of power perspective, from realist perspective, international relations, this is also to be expected. Russia will continue to support the rebels as long as Ukrainians will continue to launch its military operation against the East, and until there is a ceasefire, until there is meaningful negotiations with respect for Russia's conditions, which include federalization, the rights for the Russians to speak their language, and security neutrality, until this is the case, Putin will continue to support the rebels, and he is not the only one to blame. This is a complex international situation in which both sides are to be blamed. Both sides are involved.
Do you have any? Can I just finish by asking? Do you have any optimism, though, about the relationship between Russia and the United States? Do you think that this kind of Cold War language is here to stay? Do you think perhaps a new American president could usher in a new era in ties between Moscow and Washington?
You also asked me about the down in the airline, and we haven't even started talking about that one. The only point that I would like to make here is that American media has already made up its mind. And it seems that European media is also increasingly supportive of this main version, main hypothesis. And the problem is that this investigation is far from completed. We don't know exactly what the facts are, and Russians are presenting an entirely different viewpoint, that it was Ukrainians who did this, and they have their own facts. So until this is the case, until the investigation is completed, we have a clear case of a bias in Western media, and bias with this agenda in mind that I have already described to you, the idea of having Russia as a potential threat, potential enemy. Do I have an optimism? That was a question that you asked. It really largely depends on how the Ukrainian situation is going to be resolved. If there is a peaceful negotiation, and right now there are some preconditions for this, but very few at the moment, but if there will be peaceful negotiations, if there will be results acceptable for both Russia and European Union and the United States, this will be the new ground for moving forward.